This is Dr. Sam Murray, and I am pastor of Freedom Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church. We're located at 401 West Sullivan Street in Kingsport, Tennessee. We'd love to have you come visit with us sometime. If you need a place to come worship, you're looking for a church, try us out. See how you like it. See if the Lord gives you a blessing there. If you're already part of a good Bible-believing church, that's where you need to be. But if you're coming through or if you're looking for a church, come look for us. And we'd love to have you come worship Jesus Christ with us every time that we're there. Like I said, we're located at 401 West Sullivan Street in Kingsport, Tennessee, and this is Bible Questions, where we look at questions in the Bible, questions that people ask God, or questions that God asks people. All right. Tonight, we're looking at a question that was asked of the Lord. Some people asked the Lord this question in Luke chapter 20, verse 22. Luke chapter 20, verse 22, they asked Jesus, "Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or no?" Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or no? Meaning, is it lawful under God's law to pay taxes to this government or not? All right. Now, with any kind of Bible passage, Bible study, we want to be sure we look at this verse not in isolation, but we want to look at the context. What is the paragraph that it sits in? The paragraph that leads up to this is in Luke chapter 20, verses 19 through 22. That's the lead up, and then there's some verses following it showing how Jesus answered. So let's start our study here in Luke chapter 20, starting with verse 19. What's been happening here is this is a day or so after Jesus has had the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Then he cleared the temple and has taken control of the temple. He turned over the money changers, ran them out, ran the animals out of the temple court, and he's teaching in the temple every day there in Jerusalem. And the chief priests and the scribes, they're tired of this because they were probably getting a cut off of what the money changers were doing. And who do you think you are coming in here taking over this thing? So they're trying to plan some way to get rid of Jesus. That leads up to this paragraph, Luke chapter 20, starting in verse 19. "And the chief priests and the scribes the same hour sought to lay hands on him. And they feared the people, for they perceived that he had spoken this parable against them. And they watched him and sent forth spies, which should feign themselves just men, that they might take hold of his words, so that they might deliver him unto the power and authority of the governor." So they thought up the first plan was, let's send some spies into Jesus' audience. Let them pretend to be people who want to learn and ask him questions, and we'll ask him trick questions. All right? That leads us to verse 21. "And they asked him, saying, Master, we know that thou sayest and teachest rightly, neither acceptest thou the person of any, but teachest the way of God truly." Now you can just hear the sarcasm in this question. They're trying to butter up Jesus and say, we know you're wonderful, we know you're really of God, we know you do everything straight down the line. Here's a question for you. And the question comes now in verse 22. Is it lawful for us to give tribute unto Caesar or no? Is it lawful for us to give tribute unto Caesar or no? They asked him this question, is it lawful for we as Jews here in Israel to pay taxes to Caesar in Rome or not? Does it violate God's law? Now the purpose of this question, they thought they had Jesus in a trick question, like, have you quit beating your wife yet? Something like that. If he answers yes, that it's absolutely lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar, then the people of Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, who didn't like the Romans, would turn away from him because they didn't like having to pay taxes to Rome. If he says, no, it's not lawful under God's law to pay taxes to Rome, then they could call the Romans up, tell them, have him arrested. He's trying to be a rebellion against you and stop people paying taxes. So it was a no-win situation, they thought. Now, they asked Jesus this question, is it lawful for us to give tribute unto Caesar or no? Then in verse 23, we have Jesus' response, 23 and following. Luke 20, verse 23 and following. "But he perceived their craftiness and said unto them, Why tempt ye me?" I mean, why are you trying to test me? Why are you trying to trick me? He understood. Verse 24, he said, "Show me a penny. Whose image and superscription hath it?" They answered and said, "Caesar's." He said unto them, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which be Caesar's, and unto God the things which be God's." He said, "Show me a coin. Whose picture's on this coin?" "Well, that's Caesar's." "Okay, that's his coin." "Give unto Caesar the things that belong to Caesar. Give unto God the things that are God's. Give unto the government the things that belong to the government. Give unto God the things that belong to God or due to God." And then verse 26, they're left with their problem. And they could not take hold of his words before the people, and they marveled at his answer and held their peace, meaning he shut them up. They didn't have an answer or response for his answer. His answer was so good, they didn't have a response. See, Jesus actually separated paying taxes to the government and giving offerings to God as two separate things. It doesn't, if you're paying taxes and obeying the civilian laws, it doesn't mean you're disloyal to God. All right? It doesn't mean that at all. It's perfectly acceptable under Roman law to pay taxes to human government. It's perfectly acceptable under God's law to pay taxes to a human government. In Romans chapter 13, Paul tells us this. Romans chapter 13, starting in verse 1. Romans 13, verses 1 through 7. He says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also. For they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." Paul, agreeing with Jesus, of course, says, obey the local civilian government, obey the civilian laws. They're in place to keep order and peace, and God has allowed them to be put in place. If you're supposed to pay taxes, pay your taxes. All right? Now, a lot of people will look at tax money and say, well, okay, that's my money to God to help the poor and so forth. No. God sees them as two separate things. Render unto Caesar that was Caesar's, and render unto God as God's. Two separate issues. All right? As long as government doesn't order us to break God's law, we're supposed to obey human government as much as we possibly can. In Acts chapter 5, verse 28 through 29, the law there in Jerusalem, the chief priests and scribes, and they were the local law officers there under the Romans, they gave orders for Peter and John not to preach anymore the name of Jesus in Jerusalem, and they had to disobey that. They said we ought to obey God rather than men. That's Acts chapter 5, verse 28 through 29. In the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 3, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego were ordered to bow down and pray and worship to the statue, the idol, and they refused. It was the law, but they refused it because it was violating the law of God. In Daniel chapter 6, there was a new law passed. You can't pray to anyone except to the king for 30 days. Well, Daniel went and prayed to his God like normal, and he obeyed God. The new law of government was legal in that government, but it wasn't right by God's law. We still pray. All right. So, but paying taxes, there's nothing wrong with paying taxes to human government. There's nothing wrong with obeying the laws of the human government as long as they don't violate God's law. And we're supposed to obey human government up until that point that it says interferes with worship and service to the Lord. So yes, Jesus said, pay your taxes. All right. Be a good citizen as much as you can possibly be. Pay your taxes. If you like studies like this, then hit like, hit share, tell other people about it. Send us some questions if you want to. All right. Next week, the question is going to be a question that somebody else asked Jesus. Somebody asked him, "Art thou the King of the Jews? Are you the King of the Jews?" This is what Pilate asked Jesus. Why did he ask that? And how did Jesus respond? We'll see